Well, the Supreme Court today closing out its term with not one, but two blockbuster rulings. The first decision involving West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency delivered a huge blow to President Biden's climate agenda. But the court gave the president a big win in the second case, Biden versus Texas, which allows the administration to end the Trump-era Remain in Mexico policy. Well, here to break down what these decisions mean for the country is Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School and Newsmax analyst Alan Dershowitz. Professor, welcome back to the show. Good to see you, sir. All right, so before we get to today's Supreme Court decisions, I do want to get your reaction to something that President Biden said during the NATO meeting this morning, calling the Roe ruling destabilizing. Was this decision outrageous? He said it was outrageous. I mean, does this type of language hurt the legitimacy of the court?
I think he overstated it. I don't think the Supreme Court should have decided whether to overrule Roe versus Wade in this case, because this case only involved a Mississippi statute which prohibited abortions after 15 weeks. The court engaged in judicial activism. It reached out to decide a case not before it, and it did cause some instability in the country. But they would have had to rule on Roe versus Wade next year or the year after anyway. So it only essentially postponed the destabilizing effect. Once there was a majority on the court to overrule Roe, it was inevitable. The question was only when.
I guess to further Lindsay's question, though, Professor, I guess going overseas, standing in front of a bunch of world leaders, I brought this up earlier, that, don't you think that, taking a shot at our third branch of government is not helpful to the sanctity of that? I mean, for all the talk about undermining democracy that we've heard the last 17 months, I feel like all of these leaders saying that the court is illegitimate and that it's destabilizing, they're not doing anything to help democracy.
No, I agree with you, especially President Biden, who I voted for, but who himself back in the day had some questions about Roe versus Wade and some of these other decisions. I mean, he started out his electoral life somewhat more conservative than he is today. And I think he should use more just language that's not as provocative when he speaks abroad. You know, we used to have a rule in this country that when you leave the country, partisanship ends at the coastline. And when you get to foreign countries, you become just pro-American, pro all the American institutions. Right. That's probably a better process to follow than taking your partisanship abroad. So I am a little disappointed in the way President Biden handled the Supreme Court.
I am too. I just want to tell our viewers we're actually watching live images of President Biden returning to Joint Base Andrews from that NATO summit. But I do want to get to that opinion. Tell me if my non-legal background is off base here. But I think I see a pattern here with both Roe and this EPA decision, which is the court basically saying in Roe, hey, it's not our job to legislate. It's your job. If you want to outlaw abortion or not, then vote on it. Use elected officials. And what they said in the EPA case, at least I see him, is, hey, if you want the EPA to do something, then Congress's job to do that. It shouldn't be up to unelected bureaucrats to enact seemingly law, right?
A plus as a great law student. You're absolutely right. Wow. The environmental case really has little to do with the environment. It has much more to do with the power of administrative agencies. And the Republican majority has, for years now, kind of indicated that it would like to pull back on what's called the Chevron doctrine, which gives administrative agencies powers beyond what they were given legislatively. And this is part of that process. The impact was directly on the environment in this case, but this portends a series of cases in the future in which, if you want legislation, get it. Don't ask administrative agencies to do the job for you. They've already made those suggestions in a couple of other contexts. Today, they were clearer than they ever were before, and in the future, they'll be even clearer. So what we need is more legislation, less administrative action. And this is part of the dismantling of the administrative state, which really began to build during the New Deal. And interestingly enough, that Elena Kagan, when she was a professor at the Harvard Law School, wrote quite a bit about this. And so this is something she's been interested in for a long time as well, from an academic, political, and judicial point of view.
I do want to get your take on the Remain in Mexico policy. Obviously a win for Biden. He wasn't following this anyway to begin with, really. But do you feel like this is an erosion of U.S. sovereignty? The fact that it can't be left in place?
Well, again, if the legislature were to specifically set up rules for this, I think the court would be much more accepting of it. And I think, again, this shows a rejection of kind of administrative authority. Look, from a purely humane point of view, this was the right decision. And I hope it just causes fewer people to die in the way that those people died in that terrible van the other day, and the unsanitary conditions that applied to people who had to stay in Mexico. Again, this is part and process of a very complicated immigration argument that we're having. I think the vast majority of Americans want immigrants to come legally, lawfully, and in an orderly manner. And this decision is very complex because it involved 3 intersecting statutes that pointed in different directions. And the court, in a decision in which some of the Trump appointees went along with the liberal members, decided to resolve it in favor of the way they did it. And it was probably the right decision.
It was the first case we've seen in a while that it wasn't divided like that. So, Professor Dershowitz, appreciate your time this evening. Good to see you.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Vice President Kamala Harris is breaking her silence on the border catastrophe down in Texas, resulting in the death of 53 migrants. Her response to that's drawing some backlash. That's right after the break. Don't go away.